Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. And in this video, I'm going to be walking through the course that I'm offering here free online, particularly with Scapegoat recovery and narcissistic abuse recovery. And in this section and module, I'll be focusing on the notion of adult children of emotionally immature parents. So I'll be walking through the various aspects according to Lindsay Gibson in terms of how she defines adult children of emotionally mature parents, as well as adults that are considered emotionally mature. And so I'm going to walk through some of the key aspects of her approach, talking about externalizers versus internalizers, the notion of the different characteristics that make up an emotionally mature person, and then the impacts it has on the adult children of emotionally mature parents. And finally, I'll be covering the book No More Mr. Nice Guy at the end to just give an overview of some of the impacts, particularly for men, that can show up for this dynamic. So stay tuned, and if you do like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks and have a great day. All right, so we went through the different quadrants and I introduced you to experts and thinkers in this field, focusing on those who specialize in family dynamics, particularly being on the receiving end of those who have emotional maturity or narcissism. In this module, I'll walk you through Lindsay Gibson's work as well as Sam Vatkin's work, talk about their different approaches and how it relates to the interior of the adult or the sibling in the family. And then I'm also going to talk about being on the receiving end of that narcissistic parent or emotionally immature parent and explain what are the common characteristics of someone who grows up in that environment and how it shows up later in their life, usually as an adult. And so again, this is focusing on Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants, particularly the upper left. So this is considered the interior of the individual. So this is the inner psyche, the inner world of the individual. And so I'm going to focus on the inner psyche of the narcissistic or emotionally immature parent, and then also focus on the adult child of the emotionally mature parent and what they went through growing up, either from a narcissistic parent or emotionally mature parent. By better understanding the psyche of the narcissist or the emotionally mature parent, as well as understanding yourself as being on the receiving end of that narcissism or emotional maturity, you're going to be better equipped to having insights into yourself. How do you manage and cope with these individuals in your life or process what you went through growing up? A lot of this will probably be self-evident to you as this is your direct experience, but I think it's going to be helpful for you to see it more objectively and understand it from the experts. And the focus here is using Lindsay Gibson's work as well as Sam Vatkin's work. Lindsay Gibson is a clinical psychologist and she's written a few books, 4 of them that I've read. The first one I read was The Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. We are aware of adults who have not grown up from, let's say, 12 or 16 and how they might intellectually have evolved and able to hold a job and function in life, provide the physical needs for the child, and maybe they sometimes are able to have those emotional capacities, but on average they developmentally they're very much at a younger age. Lindsay Gibson's work is using a developmental perspective and getting you to understand that these individuals lack certain capacities and certain emotional maturity so that they're able to, in a healthy way, respond to the growing child, especially as they get older and assert themselves and their individuality. In Lindsay Gibson's book, she has some main points to consider when understanding these individuals. One of her main points of an emotionally mature parent is that they have an anxious self-preoccupation. So generally these individuals are primarily thinking about themselves. It's not so much that they don't care about their kids, but rather that they're so preoccupied by their own involvement and self that they don't have the capacity to be available to be present to their child. And she talks talks about attunement, so they don't know how to really attune often with their children. Often these children grow up feeling lonely as that parent isn't really present in their life. They grow up having a parent that's not really reliable. Some days the parent is more present and tuned with them and is available, and this could be simply that they're in a better mood, on vacation, they're happier. Maybe these parents can be more tuned during those times, but there's other times often that these parents are very much preoccupied by themselves and they have this anxious preoccupation. These parents are constantly monitoring their own emotions, a very fragile self-esteem, and constantly look for external validation. They're very much self-absorbed and it limits their ability to empathize with others, including their own children. Another aspect is rigidity and single-mindedness. Inflexible in their thinking and cannot deal with complex situations. So they're simplistic in their understandings, and this limits their ability to respond appropriately to their children. This rigidity reflects their need to control and predict situations. Perhaps you've had this experience where you express something to your parent and they avoid or they deflect or change the topic. It's not because they don't care, but more likely because they have a preoccupation with themselves and can't deal with emotional intimacy. And yet a lot of my clients who have these types of parents look for that connection in the relationship, that emotional closeness. But because these parents don't have the capacity consistently, they are constantly feeling lonely and rejected from these parents. A common situation is that being on the receiving end, you think, okay, why do other people have this relationship with their parents? Is there something wrong with me? Typically growing up in that environment, you realize that, I think as a child, you start to internalize that. You think, must be something I'm doing or it's my fault. As children, I don't think can accept that their parent doesn't love them or care about them. So to manage that, they will internalize it and blame themselves. A lot of these individuals grow up blaming themselves and believing it's their fault. And they gaslight themselves, or they might intellectually understand that their parent has certain limitations, but emotionally they are still bonded to the parent and perhaps enmeshed. They lack a fear of authentic emotions. They don't like closeness, fear that it will disrupt their fragile sense of self. They don't have the ego strength to hold the child's perspective. They have a rigidity of mind. So growing up in that environment, you're usually in a family where emotions are dismissed. There's not usually a discussion of emotions. A clear definition from Lindsay Gibson is that they lack self-reflection and accountability. Often the child growing up might get fed up when they're older, talk to their parent, but the parent doesn't take responsibility or accountability and will often avoid conversations. They often think they've done nothing wrong and they don't understand why the adult child is responding the way they are. They rarely introspect and keep things very superficial. These individuals often more reactionary emotions, so they can think that others are to blame. An internalizer is one who can self-reflect, take ownership. An externalizer blames outside themselves, externalizes their problems, and doesn't have the ability to self-reflect. Typically, if you're growing up in this environment, you're probably growing up with parents who are more externalizers. You could grow up with one parent who's emotionally mature and another parent the enabler, but let's assume that's both parents who are emotionally mature. Then you can have them both externalizing. In that family, there's no sense of self-reflection and no feedback loop. Emotions are usually dismissed. So Lindsay Gibson has 7 key concepts in understanding what it's like growing up in this environment with being on the receiving end of an emotionally mature parent. Growing up in a home where you're not often validated and it's often about the parent and their inner world isn't honored or acknowledged. These children learn very early on that I must be doing something wrong, I'm maybe too much. These emotions often too much for emotionally parents. these children grow up with low self-esteem, internalize a lot of this, and you learn to accept the family's projections that it must be something to do with yourself, or you're being too much, or asking for too much, and they can feel inadequate and unlovable. These are deep-seated in the child, and as an adult, this can lead to further problems later in life. Another aspect of people who go through this is a lack of boundaries. Because growing up in this environment with an emotionally mature parent, you're likely used to serving your parents' needs and monitoring to see what their reactions are. From a very young age, you're very much fused with an emotionally mature parent. There's a lack of boundaries often in these clients. And as they form their own family, having kids or getting married, these parents that are emotionally mature can still have influence and not fully allow the child to differentiate into their own family. And so often you see these adults that have grown up in this environment have a difficulty with boundaries. That's a key concept in Lindsay Gibson's work. There's the notion of the suppression of authentic self. You have to suppress your authentic feelings and thoughts as usually about the parent and their needs. From a young age, these children grow up not fully expressing themselves as they consider that it's not worthwhile. And so in the concept of inner family systems theory, a key concept in that is the notion of procedural logic. Mom and dad don't seem to listen to my thoughts or feelings, or when I express myself, they got upset. Therefore, I'm not going to express myself again, or it's not safe for me to express myself. So from a young age, they develop this logic, and you can consider it a limited belief. And as they get older and they're adults, they continue to hold this limited belief, and it shows up in their life and relationships. Part of the work is to learn about the authentic self again, expressing it, and learning to embody who you truly are. In the later modules, we're going to talk about healthy differentiation and individuation, and how that has to do with being your authentic self, showing up and speaking your truth, not being defined by emotionally immature or narcissistic parents. Another concept in Lindsay Gibson's work is the notion of emotional dysregulation. There's a notion that emotions are not safe to discuss. Ironically, in these homes, very chaotic, strong reactions from parents. Even though they're not comfortable with their children's reactions, they have their own unconscious emotional reactions as adults, and being in their own family or in their own relationships. These individuals might have problems or challenges with regulating their own emotions and have heightened mood swings or anxiety, and they can very quickly dysregulate. This could be having heightened anxiety or being very reactive around feedback. That's another concept of adult children of emotionally mature parents. They often have issues with emotional regulation, as this wasn't properly taught to them in their upbringing. Another concept and common situation I've found with working with a lot of my clients, and particularly with men, is if they have a narcissistic mother or emotionally mature mother, they grow up very much people pleasers. I'll reference a book called No More Mr. Nice Guy. That book goes into some of these aspects. A concept to understand is that if you grow up in an environment where your parents, it was all about serving their needs, then you very early on recognize that in order to survive in this family or environment, you have to adapt and ensure that you're pleasing or maintaining this level of status quo with your family so that you're not going to rock the boat too much. This shows up usually when they start to form their own family or in their own relationship. They find that they're trying to please their wife or their husband. They're also trying to please their parents or their children or other people in their life. They feel unsatisfied as they feel like they're doing everything to ensure that people remain happy and that there's no conflict. But often there's a sense that they're not fully satisfied themselves and feeling taken advantage of, or feeling walked over, or perhaps they're not feeling respected from their partner. And this all stems usually from growing up in this type of environment from a very young age. You were taught that your main purpose is to serve the parents' needs versus the parents serving your needs. In a healthy family, it's the parents' role and responsibility to serve the children's emotional needs and ensure that they're being supported psychologically and emotionally. But when it's reversed, when you grow up, you're doing everything right just to be a good person, There's a sense that you're trying to please others and there's no conflict or disharmony. That's just an understanding of a common situation, people pleasing.